A young plantation heir follows a broken hymn through the morning mist and finds a child swinging from an oak tree, feet barely touching the ground. The rope snaps under his knife. She gasps back to life in his arms. But this girl remembers everything, every word, every threat, every secret whispered in the dark. When she opens the family Bible, faded ink reveals a promise someone tried to erase. The overseer's eyes go cold. Patrollers gather like storm clouds. Courthouse bells ring as the truth walks up wooden steps, and a perfect memory stands ready to speak what powerful men buried. The sign said, "White men don't forgive," but when the gavel falls and the crowd holds its breath, will one man's courage prove that some promises are worth dying for? The cornfield stood grey in the dawn mist, stalks rustling like whispered prayers. Cullen Avery pulled his horse to a halt on the patrol road, head tilted toward a sound that didn't belong. A voice, thin as a cricket's wing, rose from somewhere beyond the fence line. It was singing. He slid from the saddle and pushed through the corn rows, following that threadbare melody. The voice cracked, choked, then picked up again, a hymn he knew from childhood, but wrong somehow, too weak, too desperate. The tree stood alone at the field's edge, an old oak with one low branch that stretched toward the road like a pointing finger. From that branch hung a small figure, feet barely off the ground, a rough board swinging against her chest. Cullen's knife was out before he fully understood what he was seeing. The rope snapped clean, and the child collapsed into his arms, a little slave girl, maybe 8 years old, her breath coming in sharp gasps against his shoulder. The board clattered to the ground beside them. Painted in crude white letters, it read, "White man don't forgive." She was alive. Her pulse hammered against his wrist like a trapped bird. Around her neck, rope burns marked her skin in angry red lines. But she breathed. She lived. Cullen lifted her onto his horse and rode hard for the plantation house, the board forgotten in the dirt behind him. The kitchen would be warm. The cook would know what to do. Aunt Millie's hands moved quick and sure, pressing a damp cloth to the child's throat, while Isaiah, the stable hand, held a tin cup to her lips. The bitter smell of feverfew tea filled the kitchen as the girl's eyes fluttered open. She stared at Cullen, with eyes dark as river stones, wide and watchful. Around her thin wrist, a faded blue ribbon was wrapped twice and knotted tight, her only ornament, her only treasure. "What's your name, child?" Aunt Millie's voice was gentle as cooling salve. "Lila." The word came out cracked, like glass with a hairline break. "Who did this to you?" Cullen knelt beside the rough wooden table where she lay. "Who hung that sign around your neck?" Lila's fingers touched the ribbon at her wrist. She drew a shaky breath and began to hum the same hymn he'd heard in the field. Then, in a voice steady as clockwork, she began to speak. "String her up nice and neat," the big one said. "Not high enough to kill, just high enough to teach." That was Pike talking. "Pike from your place." She paused, swallowed. "White man don't forgive, girl," he told me when he nailed the board. "Not for the likes of you." Then he spat right there in the dirt and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The words fell like stones into still water. Cullen's blood chilled. Pike was the plantation overseer, hired by his father to manage the hands and keep order. A man with thick arms and cold eyes who carried a hickory switch. "She's repeating it exact," Isaiah whispered, word for word, like she swallowed a recording device. But recording devices were things from newspaper stories about distant cities. This was just a little girl with burns on her neck and perfect memory trapped behind her eyes. "You rest now," Aunt Millie said, smoothing the child's hair. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Lila nodded but didn't close her eyes. She watched Cullen like she was reading words written on his face, studying him the way she might study a book. The big house felt hollow in the morning light. Samuel Avery sat propped in his bed, grey whiskers bristling above the quilt. Once he'd been broad-shouldered and commanding, but sickness had whittled him down to sharp angles and bitter complaints. "You cut down a patrol warning?" His voice rattled with phlegm. "Boy, you've got sawdust for brains." Cullen stood at the foot of the bed, hat in hand. "She's just a child, Father. They left her to strangle slow. And what business is that of ours?" Samuel's fingers drummed against the quilt. "Pike's the patrol captain's cousin. Captain Morrison holds our note at the bank. You think I want him hearing how my son interferes with discipline?" The room smelled of camphor and old sweat. Dust motes danced in the window light like tiny ghosts. "We can't send her back," Cullen said. Not after what they did. We can and we will. Soon as the talk dies down. Samuel coughed into his handkerchief. Put her in the quarters for now. Keep her out of sight. And burn that blasted sign before someone sees it. But Cullen had already thrown the board into the kitchen fire. The painted words had curled and blackened, but they lived now in his memory, seared as deep as the rope burns on Lila's throat. 3 days later, Lila wandered into the parlor where the family Bible rested on a small shelf. Cullen found her there, fingers tracing the gilt letters on the leather cover. "Can you read?" he asked. She shook her head, then nodded, then shrugged a child's honest confusion. "Some. Letters make sounds. Sounds make words." She opened the Bible carefully, pages rustling like autumn leaves. In the margin, beside a psalm, faded ink caught the lamplight. Lila bent close, her lips moving silently. "What does it say?" Cullen sat beside her, on the wooden bench. Hard words first. She pointed to scratched Latin text. "Manumissio, liber." Her voice stumbled over the syllables. Then regular words. "For the child born on Avery ground in the year of storms, freedom promised when duties are fulfilled and debts are paid." Cullen's heart stopped. His mother's handwriting. He knew those careful loops and crosses from 100 childhood letters. She died when he was 12, but her marks remained. "There's more," Lila said. A name scratched out, and a date. The date was 8 years past. The year of Lila's birth, if the child remembered right. And the name beneath the scratches, someone had tried to erase it, but traces remained. Enough to piece together. "The girl-child Lila," he read slowly, "born to Beulah and fathered unknown, but claimed in Christ's name for eventual freedom." Lila's ribbon fluttered as her hand shook. "My mama's name was Beulah. She died birthing me," they said. Freedom promised. Freedom written in his mother's hand and hidden in God's book. But promises meant nothing if the promiser was dead and the promised child wore rope burns. Still, it was something. A seed of hope planted in holy margin space. Sunday evening brought the country chapel service, oil lamps flickering against rough wooden walls. Cullen tied a clean scarf around Lila's neck to hide the healing burns and led her through the door just as the preacher began his call to prayer. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind through grass. The Averys had always sat in front, but bringing a slave child to worship was unusual. Bringing one who looked like she'd survived a hanging was downright strange. "Evening, Cullen." Reverend Benton nodded from the pulpit. "Child, you're welcome in God's house." Lila ducked her head but didn't speak. Her fingers worried the ribbon at her wrist while the hymn began. When she started humming along, harmonizing in a voice clear as spring water, more heads turned. The service moved through prayers and scripture. Lila listened with fierce attention, lips moving silently as she memorized each word. When the preacher spoke of mercy and forgiveness, she leaned forward like she was storing away something precious. Then came the sound of boots on the wooden floor. Pike stepped from the back pew, his face split by a cold smile. He'd been drinking. Cullen could smell corn liquor on him from 3 rows away. The overseer's eyes fixed on Lila, and his smile widened. "Well now," Pike said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look what crawled in here looking for salvation." Silence fell thick as clay. The preacher's hand froze on his Bible. "Pike!" Cullen warned. But the overseer wasn't finished. He pointed one thick finger at Lila, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. "You think bringing that child in here makes you a saint, boy? That little neck stretcher there knows what she earned, and she knows what I told her." His grin turned ugly. "White man don't forgive, remember? White man don't forgive." The words echoed off the wooden walls like a curse. Every face in the chapel turned toward Cullen and Lila, waiting to see what would happen next. Cullen's blood hammered in his ears. His hands shook as he stood, chair scraping against the floor. When he spoke, his voice carried clear to the rafters. "Then let one white man try." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a struck match. Pike's smile faded. The congregation held its breath, and in that charged silence, Lila began to hum again the same hymn she'd been singing when Cullen found her hanging from the tree. But this time her voice was strong and sure, weaving through the rafters like a promise that some things could not be strangled, some things would not be silenced, some things would not forgive, but some things would. The plantation kitchen became Lila's world in the weeks that followed. Aunt Millie taught her to knead bread dough and stir soup, while her voice floated through the work, always humming, always remembering something heard once and held forever. "Child's got music in her bones," Aunt Millie said, watching Lila help with the evening meal, "and books in her head, way she recalls things." It was true. Ask Lila what the preacher had said the Sunday before, and she'd recite his sermon word for word. Show her a page from the almanac, and she'd remember where each number sat. The Latin phrases from the Bible margin rolled off her tongue like she'd been born speaking dead languages. When Samuel Avery's fever spiked in the night, they brought Lila to his bedside. Her soft humming seemed to regulate his ragged breathing, smoothing the sharp edges of his distress. The old man's eyes would flutter closed, and his fist would unclench from around the quilt. "Strangest thing," the white doctor murmured, watching Lila rock beside the bed. Almost like she knows what calms him, but it was more than calming. When the doctor set down his leather bag, Lila's eyes caught the Latin label on a small brown bottle. "Laudanum," she said quietly, "for pain and troubled sleep." The doctor blinked. "You read Latin, child?" Lila shrugged. "Words are words. Some just dress fancier." Old Isaiah had worked the plantation for 40 years, his back bent from cotton sacks and his eyes sharp from watching. When he beckoned Cullen toward the smokehouse one evening, his weathered face was grave. "You need to see Pike's ledger," he said. "Been keeping it locked up in the loft, but locks ain't much good when you know where the key hides." The ledger was bound in cracked leather, its pages covered with Pike's cramped handwriting. Names, dates, prices, sales. The business of human property recorded in black ink. Lila crouched under the table as Cullen read, her fingers tracing lines in the dusty floor. When he read names aloud, she whispered them back, not just repeating, but organizing, sorting, finding patterns in the chaos of entries. "Look there," she said, pointing to a line halfway down the page. "That baby sale don't match." Cullen bent closer. The handwriting was different, shakier, more careful, and the seal at the bottom was wrong somehow. The wax was too fresh, the ring mark too deep. "Says here a girl child born stillborn to Beulah," he read. "Buried same day, no sale recorded." "But I ain't dead," Lila said simply, "and I wasn't buried. Someone had altered the ledger, changed a birth record to a death record, erasing a living child from the books." But why hide Lila's existence unless she represented something valuable, something worth concealing? The more they studied Pike's records, the clearer it became. The overseer had been selling children on the side, pocketing the money, and covering his tracks with false entries. Lila should have been sold years ago, but something had protected her, maybe her mother's connection to the Avery family, maybe the manumission promise hidden in the Bible. Until now. Until Pike decided she knew too much, remembered too much, posed too great a threat to his schemes. Thomas Hale was young for a courthouse clerk, but his handwriting was careful and his heart was decent. When Cullen rode into town with Lila perched behind him on the saddle, Thomas welcomed them into his small office without questions. "I need freedom papers drawn up," Cullen said. "Based on a manumission clause my mother wrote." Thomas studied the Bible page they'd carefully torn from the margin. His fingers traced the faded ink while Lila watched with bright eyes. "This is binding," he said finally. "Irregular, but legal, if I can verify the seal." He pulled out the plantation deed and compared the wax impressions. Lila leaned forward, studying both documents with the concentration of a jeweler examining diamonds. "The ring mark's different," she said. "See how this one's deeper, and the wax is newer wax, different color underneath." Thomas looked closer. The child was right. Someone had been using a forged seal to authenticate false documents. Pike's theft went deeper than skimmed sales. He'd been falsifying the plantation's entire ledger system. "I'll draft the papers," Thomas said. "But you should know this won't be easy. Pike has friends, powerful friends who benefit from his flexibility with records." Still, when the freedom papers were complete, the fresh ink gleaming on official parchment, Cullen felt something lift from his chest. Hope, maybe, or purpose. Something he'd been missing since his mother died. The secret blessing happened on a quiet evening, the plantation porch lit by a single oil lamp. Reverend Benton arrived just as the sun touched the horizon, his Bible tucked under one arm. "This is unusual," he said, adjusting his spectacles. A freedom blessing before manumission is legally recognized. The legal part's coming, Cullen said, but the promise part needs saying, now. They gathered in a small circle, Cullen, Lila, Isaiah, Aunt Millie, and the Reverend. The lamp flame danced in the evening breeze, throwing soft shadows across the wooden boards. Cullen knelt beside Lila's chair and took her small hand in both of his. The words came slowly, carefully chosen. Before God and these witnesses, I claim this child as my bound responsibility until she can be freed. I promise to protect her, to see her educated, to honor the freedom promised by my mother's hand. Lila's ribbon caught the lamplight as she nodded. And I promise to remember, she said, to hold truth safe until it can speak. Reverend Benton placed one hand on each of their heads. His voice carried the weight of generations when he spoke. What is bound in love shall be loosed in freedom. What is planted in faith shall bloom in justice. God has already written this child's name in freedom ink. Let no man's hand erase it. The blessing felt solid as stone, safe as the porch beneath their feet, real as the lamp flame that pushed back the darkness. For one golden moment, everything seemed possible. But Pike had been watching. Pike had been listening. And Pike had powerful friends who didn't like their business arrangements disturbed. The storm began 3 days later with a visit from Captain Morrison, banknote holder, patrol captain, and Pike's cousin by marriage. He rode up to the big house with papers in his hand and mud on his boots. Samuel, he said, settling into the parlor chair like he owned it. We need to talk about your boy's recent activities. Samuel coughed into his handkerchief, his face gray with exhaustion. What activities? Interfering with patrol business, forging freedom documents, encouraging rebellion among the hands. Morrison's smile was sharp as broken glass. Pike tells me young Cullen's been bewitched by that hanging girl, making promises he can't keep. The papers are legal, Cullen said from the doorway. Morrison laughed. Legal? Boy, Pike burned those pages from your mama's Bible. Burned the altered ledger too. Claims you doctored both to cover your own theft from the plantation accounts. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Without the Bible page, without the ledger entries, the Freedom Papers became worthless, just Thomas Hale's word against Pike's sworn testimony. You can't prove what you burned, Cullen said. Don't have to. Morrison stood, papers rustling in his hand. Pike swears the girl tried to hang herself rather than face punishment for theft. Says you cut her down and cooked up this freedom story to cover the scandal. The lie was perfect in its simplicity. Who would believe a scarred slave child over a white overseer with 20 years' experience? Who would take Cullen's word over Pike's sworn statement? As if summoned by Morrison's words, Pike appeared in the parlor doorway. His smile was cold triumph. Time to face facts, boy. No white man's going to forgive you for the mess you've made. And no white man's going to forgive that little witch for bewitching you. The words from the hanging sign, spoken again. The curse made fresh. The storm that broke that night was the worst anyone could remember. Rain lashed the plantation house, while wind howled through the oak trees, and in that chaos, the patrollers came for Cullen. They bound his hands and loaded him into a wagon, bound for the county jail to await trial for document forgery and incitement to rebellion. Through the rain-lashed canvas, he could see Lila watching from the kitchen doorway, her face pale as candle wax. The wagon wheels churned through mud as they headed for the river crossing. But the storm had swollen the water past its banks, and the ferry strained against its moorings like a horse fighting its traces. "River's too high," the ferryman shouted over the wind. "We'll have to wait till morning." But morning might be too late. By dawn, Pike's story would be accepted truth, and the questions Lila could answer would be buried under perjured testimony. That's when Isaiah appeared on the opposite bank, his lantern swinging through the rain, and beside him, barely visible in the storm, stood Lila. She cupped her hands around her mouth and began to sing. Not the hymn from the chapel, but something older, a work song, a navigation song, passed down through generations of enslaved workers. "Follow the drinking gourd," her voice carried across the water. "When the riverbank bends, step where the cypress leans." The patrollers looked at each other. The ferryman scratched his head. "She's singing the shallows," the boatman said suddenly. "Old river song. Tells you where to cross when the water's up." They had no choice. The regular ferry was useless, and the jail wagon couldn't wait. If they wanted to get Cullen across the river, they'd have to trust the navigation song of the child they'd tried to hang. One by one, Lila's verses guided them through the storm-dark water. Each line pointed to a landmark, a fallen log, a bent tree, a sandbar hidden just beneath the surface. Her memory held the river's secrets, coded in music and passed down through generations of people who'd needed to know safe passage. When the wagon finally lurched onto the far bank, water streaming from the wheels, Captain Morrison stared at Lila with something like fear. How does she know that song? Isaiah's smile was grim. Same way she knows everything else. She remembers what she hears. And she heard that song from her grandmother, who heard it from hers. The power that had saved them was the same power Pike had tried to silence. Memory, truth, the accumulated wisdom of people who'd survived by knowing things others preferred forgotten. But as the wagon rolled away toward the jail, Cullen realized that power might not be enough. Sometimes the truth could save you from drowning. Sometimes it couldn't save you from hanging. The county jail squatted like a toad in the town square, its stone walls slick with rain. Cullen's cell was a box of shadows, bars cutting the lamplight into sharp lines across the floor. Through the high window, he could see the courthouse steps where his trial would begin. At first light, Thomas Hale visited after midnight, his young face creased with worry. "Pike's testimony is solid," he whispered through the bars. "Morrison's backing every word. Without the physical evidence, the Bible page, the ledger entries, it's their word against yours. What about Lila? She can testify to what she heard, what she saw." Thomas shook his head. "The law doesn't recognize slave testimony against white men. Her word means nothing in court. The unfairness of it burned like acid. The one person who knew the truth, who could speak Pike's own words back to him in perfect detail, was silenced by the color of her skin. There has to be something," Cullen said. "Maybe." Thomas pulled a small object from his pocket, Cullen's mother's ring, heavy with the Avery seal. "Pike couldn't burn this, and Lila's memory. If she can point out the forgeries in front of the magistrate, show exactly how the seals differ." It was a thread, thin as spider silk, but something to grasp. "The trial starts at sunrise," Thomas said. "I'll do what I can." When he left, the jail settled into silence, broken only by rain on stone. Cullen closed his eyes and thought of Lila's voice guiding them through the storm. Some gifts couldn't be chained, some truths couldn't be silenced, he hoped. Dawn came grey and heavy, clouds pressing low over the town square. Already a crowd was gathering, plantation owners, townsfolk, field hands who'd been given permission to witness the trial. Word had spread about the hanging girl and the young master who'd cut her down. Cullen was marched up the courthouse steps in shackles, Pike walking close behind with the smug satisfaction of a man whose lies had taken root. Captain Morrison stood near the magistrate's bench, papers in hand, ready to present his cousin's version of events. The magistrate was Jeremiah Cobb, a weathered man with silver whiskers and eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier justice. He called for order with a voice that could silence a thunderstorm. "Case of the Commonwealth versus Cullen Avery," he announced. "Charges include forgery of legal documents, theft of plantation property, and incitement to rebellion among enslaved persons." Pike stepped forward to give his testimony. The lies flowed smooth as honey: how Cullen had altered the plantation ledger, forged his mother's handwriting, coached the slave girl to support his deception; how the child had actually tried to hang herself in shame over her own thievery, and Cullen had turned her near suicide into a heroic rescue. "The boy's been addled by abolitionist ideas," Pike concluded. "Thinks he can rewrite the natural order with a few scratches in a book margin," the crowd murmured. Agreement. The story made sense to them: a young man corrupted by dangerous ideas, a slave girl too ashamed to face punishment. It fit their understanding of how the world worked. Thomas Hale stood to present Cullen's defense. He was nervous, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Your Honor, I submit that the defendant acted on legitimate legal grounds. The manumission clause written by his mother established clear—" "Where is this clause?" Magistrate Cobb interrupted. "I see no physical evidence." "It was destroyed in a fire," Thomas's voice faltered. "But witnesses can attest to its existence." Pike laughed. "Convenient fire, that. Burned up all the evidence that would prove him wrong." The trial was slipping away like water through cupped hands. Without the Bible page, without the original ledger, Cullen's story sounded like desperate invention. Then came the sound everyone had been waiting for, the soft shuffle of bare feet on courthouse steps. Lila appeared at the edge of the crowd, her small figure dwarfed by the sea of adults around her. She clutched something in her hands, a weathered piece of wood that made several people gasp, the hanging sign. Someone had saved it from the tree where Pike had nailed it weeks ago. The crowd parted as Lila climbed the courthouse steps. Her neck scarf had slipped, revealing the faded rope burns that marked her throat like a necklace of scars. In the morning light, the evidence of her near hanging was stark and undeniable. She stopped in front of the magistrate's bench and held up the wooden sign. The painted words had been partially burned away, but enough remained to read. "White man don't forgive. Your Honor," she said, her young voice carrying clearly across the square. "I remember everything they said the night they hung this around my neck." Pike's face went pale. "She can't testify." The law recognizes truth," Magistrate Cobb said quietly. "Continue, child." And so Lila began to speak. Her voice was steady as clockwork as she recited Pike's exact words from that night. The threats, the laughter, the mocking promise that white men never forgive. She described his gestures, his tone, the way he'd spat in the dirt after nailing the sign. "String her up nice and neat," he told the others. "Not high enough to kill, just high enough to teach." Then he said, "White man don't forgive, girl, not for the likes of you." The accuracy was devastating. Pike had spoken those words to only 3 men that night, and now they echoed across the courthouse square in perfect detail. His own voice, captured and preserved in the memory of a child who forgot nothing. Thomas Hale stepped forward with the Avery ring and a clean sheet of paper. "Your Honor, may I ask the witness to examine these items?" Lila took the ring in her small hands, studying the carved seal with fierce concentration. Then she pressed it into fresh candle wax and compared the impression to a document Thomas produced, one of Pike's recent ledger entries. "This is wrong," she said, pointing to the ledger. "The seal's too deep, and the wax is different. Someone made a copy ring, but they pressed too hard." She turned to Pike, her dark eyes holding his gaze without flinching. "You made fake papers using a fake seal, but this one," she held up the Avery ring, "this one's real. This one belonged to Master Cullen's mama." The magistrate leaned forward. "How do you know the difference, child?" "Same way. I know words," Lila said simply. "Same way I know songs. When you see something true next to something false, the false part stands out like a cracked bell." Pike's composure cracked. He stepped forward, face flushed with anger. "You can't believe this little witch over a white man's sworn testimony." "I believe evidence," Magistrate Cobb replied. "And the evidence suggests someone has been forging plantation documents." Isaiah emerged from the crowd, his weathered hands holding a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Found this buried behind the smokehouse, Your Honor. Thought it might be important." The bundle contained charred paper fragments, pieces of the original ledger and Bible page that Pike thought he'd destroyed completely. Enough remained to show the original handwriting, the genuine seal impressions, and the manumission clause in its faded but legible glory. "For the child born on Avery ground," Magistrate Cobb read aloud. "Freedom promised when duties are fulfilled and debts are paid." The courthouse square fell silent as the truth assembled itself piece by piece, Pike's forgeries exposed. Lila's legal claim to freedom established, the conspiracy of silence shattered by a child's perfect memory. Pike made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. "She's a witch, I tell you. Unnatural memory, unnatural gifts. She's not even fully human." But his words fell flat. The crowd had seen the evidence, heard the testimony, witnessed the truth emerge from lies. Whatever else Lila might be, she was brave enough to speak truth to power, and that was human enough for anyone. The magistrate took his time studying the evidence. The courthouse square buzzed with whispered conversations as people processed what they'd witnessed. The revelation that Pike had been forging documents sent ripples of unease through the crowd. How many other plantation records were false? How many other illegal schemes had he been running? Captain Morrison stood near the courthouse wall, his face pale as buttermilk. His cousin's crimes would reflect on him, threaten his position as patrol captain, maybe even implicate him in the forgery conspiracy. "Your Honor," he said, stepping forward, Even if some irregularities occurred, the fact remains that this slave girl is property, legal property owned by the Avery plantation. Disputed property, Thomas Hale corrected, with documented claim to freedom based on the Ibrong, deceased Mrs. Avery's written promise. Magistrate Cobb held up the burned fragments of the Bible page. This manumission clause appears genuine. The handwriting matches other documents in the court record bearing Mrs. Avery's signature. But the conditions weren't met, Morrison argued. Duties fulfilled and debts paid? Young Avery hasn't paid any debts. His father owes money all over the county. The debts referenced here appear to be personal obligations, the magistrate said. Duties to the family, to the child herself. The promise of protection and eventual freedom. Lila stepped forward again, her small voice cutting through the debate. I can read the rest of it. The part that's faded. She knelt beside the evidence table and traced her finger over the charred paper fragments. Her lips moved silently as she puzzled out the barely visible words. When the child shows gifts of mind and spirit, when she proves herself worthy of trust, when she stands before God and man without shame, then let her bonds be broken and her freedom declared. The courthouse square held its breath. Leela looked up from the fragments, her eyes bright with understanding. I stood before God in the chapel. I stood before man in this courthouse. I showed my gifts and proved my trust. She turned to face the magistrate directly. The conditions are met, Your Honor, Pike snarled from where he stood, chained between two deputies. Words on a page don't change nature. She's still what she was born. She was born free, Cullen said, speaking for the first time since the trial began. His voice carried across the square with quiet conviction. My mother saw it, wrote it, promised it. I'm just here to honor that promise. The magistrate nodded slowly. The manumission clause is legally binding. The child Lila has demonstrated the conditions specified by Mrs. Avery. The evidence supports her claim to freedom. He turned to Pike, his voice cold as winter wind. As for you, Mr. Pike, the evidence of forgery and document falsification is overwhelming. You'll stand trial for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. But Pike wasn't finished. As the deputies moved to take him away, he broke free for one desperate moment and lunged toward Lila. His voice was a snarl of rage and defeat. White man, don't forgive. You hear me, girl? White man, don't forgive. The words echoed off the courthouse walls, the same curse he'd carved into the wooden sign, the same threat he'd whispered as he'd strung the noose around her neck. But this time, Lila didn't flinch. She stood straight as a pine tree, her ribbon bright at her wrist, her scars visible for all to see. This white man forgives, Cullen said, moving to stand beside her. And this one keeps his promises. The curse was broken, the sign's words turned inside out. Where hate had carved its message in wood and rope and terror, love wrote its answer in law and witness and the courage of a child who remembered everything. Everything, including the fact that some promises are worth keeping. The courthouse clerk's office smelled of ink and parchment and possibility. Thomas Hale's hands shook slightly as he prepared the official manumission document, each letter formed with careful precision. Lila sat on a wooden chair beside his desk, swinging her feet and watching the words appear like magic under his quill. Be it known by these presents, Thomas read as he wrote, that the child called Lila, born on Avery Plantation in the year of our Lord 1836, is hereby declared free and manumitted from all bonds of servitude. The words looked different, written in legal script, formal, official, permanent, not scrawled in a Bible margin or whispered in kitchen corners, but proclaimed in the clear daylight of the law. Magistrate Cobb supervised the process, his silver whiskers catching the afternoon light. When Thomas finished writing, he heated red wax over a candle flame and prepared to seal the document with the genuine Avery ring. This is irregular, the magistrate said. Usually freedom papers require payment of compensation to the owner. The child was promised freedom, Cullen replied. My mother's promise constitutes consideration. And besides, he smiled, how do you put a price on someone who was never properly enslaved to begin with? The hot wax dripped onto the parchment. Cullen pressed his mother's ring into the soft surface, the carved seal leaving its mark in crimson. When he lifted the ring, the impression was perfect, clear, deep, and genuine. Sealed this day in the presence of Thomas Hale, clerk, and Jeremiah Cobb, magistrate, Thomas wrote beneath the wax. Let no man contest what is here established. Lila reached out to touch the dried wax, her finger tracing the seal impression. It's really real? It's written now where no man can unwrite it, Thomas said softly. Through the office window, the courthouse square was emptying as people returned to their daily business. Pike had been led away in chains, his conspiracy exposed and his power broken. Captain Morrison faced his own investigation for supporting forged documents. The old order was cracking, letting light through the gaps, but the real change wasn't in the courthouse. It was in the small girl who now held legal proof that she belonged to herself. The plantation house looked different when they returned, smaller somehow, as if acknowledging that its power to bind was broken. Samuel Avery sat on the front porch, wrapped in a quilt despite the warm afternoon. His fever had broken during the trial, leaving him weak but clear-headed. So it's done? He asked as Cullen and Lila climbed the porch steps. It's done. Cullen handed him the freedom papers. Lila is legally free. Samuel studied the document with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Your mother would be proud, he said finally. She always said promises matter more than profits. Other plantation workers had gathered Isaiah, Aunt Millie, field hands who'd heard about the trial. They stood in the yard, waiting to see what would happen next. Freedom for one child was remarkable, but it didn't change the bonds that held the rest of them. Cullen seemed to understand their unspoken question. He pulled out a handwritten document, something he'd prepared during the ride home. I'm making changes, he announced. The overseer system ends today. No more whips, no more selling families apart. Everyone will earn wages for their work. The children will have schooling in the evenings. The promises sounded too good to be true. But Lila's freedom had seemed impossible that morning, and now it was real as the paper in Samuel's hands. What about when your father dies? One of the field hands asked bluntly. What happens to these promises then? They're written down, Cullen said, signed and witnessed. Legal as any deed. He looked around the circle of faces, hope warring with doubt, trust battling experience. These people had heard promises before. Most had been broken. I know words are cheap, he continued. I know you've got reason to doubt. But Lila's freedom proves that sometimes words on paper matter. Sometimes promises get kept. Reverend Benton arrived just as the sun touched the horizon, his Bible tucked under his arm and his face bright with the news from town. Heard you had quite a day in court, he said, shaking Cullen's hand. God's truth will out, Cullen replied. Indeed it will. The Reverend looked at the gathered crowd. Seems fitting to mark this day with thanksgiving. He opened his Bible to a familiar psalm and began to read. He brought them out of darkness and the shadow of death and broke their chains in pieces. His voice carried across the porch and into the yard. Let them give thanks unto the Lord for his goodness. When he began to sing, the voices that joined him came from every corner of the gathering. Black voices and white voices, field hands and house servants, the freed and the still-bound. The harmony was ragged at first, then stronger, weaving together like different threads in a common fabric. Lila's voice rose above the rest, clear and true, carrying the melody they all followed. The child who'd been silenced by rope around her throat now led them all in song. The music curled around the porch columns and drifted across the fields, carrying promises and possibilities into the gathering dusk. For this one moment, on this one porch, the old divisions seemed less important than the shared hope that tomorrow might be different, better, free. 3 weeks later, in the cool of early evening, Lila sat on an overturned bucket in the corner of the old barn. A piece of charcoal was in her hand, and dust covered the floor around her feet, letters and words traced in careful script. See how the A stands straight, she told. The younger children gathered around her, like a tent peak, strong enough to hold up the whole word. 6 little faces watched with fierce concentration as she demonstrated each letter. Reading was dangerous for enslaved children, illegal in most places, punishable by whip or worse. But here, now, in this barn on this plantation, it was simply a gift being shared. Now you try, Lila said, handing the charcoal to a boy named Samuel. Write your own name in the dust. Above their heads, hanging from a peg on the barn wall, was the battered sign from the hanging tree. But the original words were gone, scorched away by deliberate burning. In their place, written in Lila's careful hand, was a simple verse. Truth and mercy, have met together. Isaiah worked nearby, mending a broken halter while he listened to the reading lesson. Aunt Millie hummed in the doorway, her voice weaving through the evening air. The sounds of the plantation were different, now less tension, more purpose, as if the land itself was learning to breathe easier. Outside, Cullen loaded supplies into a wagon. Tomorrow he'd travel to other plantations, carrying news of what was possible, trying to plant seeds of change in ground that might prove fertile. The work would be dangerous, challenging the old ways always was. But Lila's example had shown him that courage could be contagious. "Master Cullen?" one of the children asked. "Will you teach us reading too?" Cullen paused in his packing. "I'm not your master anymore," he said gently. "Just Cullen. And yes, I'll help with the teaching." The distinction mattered. Words mattered. Promises mattered. As darkness gathered outside, the children practiced their letters in the dust. Each carefully formed mark was an act of rebellion against a system that preferred them ignorant. Each whispered syllable was a victory snatched from the throat of oppression. Lila smiled, her ribbon bright against her wrist, and closed the lesson with one last demonstration. In large, clear letters, she wrote her full name in the dirt: Lila Avery. The surname was new, freely chosen, legally recognized, a sign that she belonged to the family that had freed her rather than the system that had bound her. "That's my real name," she told the children. "The one I picked for myself." She underlined it once more in the dust, then blew gently across the letters. They rose like a small cloud and vanished into the darkening air, temporary marks on temporary ground. But the truth they represented was permanent as freedom ink, lasting as love, enduring as the memory of a child who had refused to let terror have the final word. The sign had proclaimed that white men don't forgive. The story had proven that some do. And in the space between curse and blessing, between hanging and freedom, between the old world and the new, a little girl's courage had rewritten the ending that seemed carved in stone. Under the porch light of grace, promises kept their word.